Hitler spent the summer of 1940 waiting for a phone call that would never come. In his mind, Britain was supposed to be the reasonable power, the one European nation he believed he understood, and the one nation he was convinced would eventually sit down, negotiate, and accept a new balance of power on the continent. What makes this moment so fascinating is how completely wrong he was, but the reasons behind his expectation weren't random. They came from years of assumptions, misread signals, racial theories, and overconfidence, wrapped in the illusion that he was a strategic genius. This is the story of why Hitler sincerely believed Britain would choose peace, while Britain was preparing for the longest struggle in its history. To understand his logic, you have to start with the way he viewed the British Empire. In his worldview, Britain wasn't an enemy. It was an example of what he wanted Germany to become, a global empire built on expansion, sea power, and hierarchy. He spoke about Britain with admiration in private. He believed the British had built their empire through toughness, discipline, and a willingness to be ruthless when necessary. In his warped worldview, they were Aryan cousins, a people he saw as racially compatible with Germans. He didn't fantasize about controlling Britain. He fantasized about Britain recognizing Germany as the rightful ruler of the European continent, while Britain kept its global empire. In his head, this wasn't a rivalry, it was a partnership waiting to happen. But admiration is not understanding, and this became one of the biggest miscalculations of his leadership. Hitler assumed that because he respected Britain, Britain would respect Germany's new power. He believed that once France fell, Britain would see the writing on the wall. Europe was German. The continent was unified under one dominant force, and Britain, being rational, would choose to cut a deal instead of resisting a future that seemed inevitable. What he didn't understand was that Britain wasn't thinking strategically in 1940. It was thinking emotionally, in a way he never predicted. Britain's leadership had no desire to accept a Europe run by a dictator, and the British people, far from being demoralized, were united in a way that even Churchill hadn't predicted. The fall of France didn't break British morale, it hardened it. Hitler didn't expect that. He had spent years viewing democracy as weak, indecisive and soft. He assumed that a democratic people, left alone on an island with no continental allies, would logically negotiate. This was the first pillar of his delusion, believing democracies break before dictatorships. The second pillar came from his overconfidence after his early victories. Poland had fallen quickly, Norway had fallen, the Low Countries had collapsed France. The same nation that had bled Germany dry in the First World War had been overwhelmed in a matter of weeks. The psychological effect this had on Hitler was enormous. In his mind, he had achieved what generations of German leaders had failed to do. And if he could collapse France so fast, surely Britain would recognize that resisting him was pointless. Hitler wasn't just predicting peace, he was projecting his own shock onto the British. If he found France's collapse stunning, he assumed the British would too, but the British response wasn't shock, it was defiance. The third reason Hitler expected peace was that he misunderstood Churchill completely. To him, Churchill was temporary. A loud, stubborn figure who had somehow risen to power at the worst moment for diplomacy, Hitler believed that eventually the British establishment, the aristocrats, the bureaucrats, the business leaders, would get tired of Churchill's speeches and pressure him into a settlement. He thought Churchill was an outlier, not a symbol of national willpower. He didn't realize that Churchill had arrived at exactly the right moment for the British imagination. He was the voice people wanted to hear. A voice that said, no compromise, no agreement, no handshake. Hitler kept waiting for Britain to come to its senses, not realizing that Britain had already made its decision. The fourth reason was strategic. Hitler didn't want a two-front war. He knew from Germany's First World War experience that fighting East and West at the same time was a path to collapse. His real long-term plan was always aimed at the East. Resources, land, raw materials, all of it was in that direction. Britain was a distraction, a problem he didn't want to spend years dealing with. So he convinced himself that Britain would eventually choose peace because he needed Britain to choose peace. It made his future plans cleaner. It made his ambitions possible. His assumption wasn't based on British behaviour, it was based on his desire. And that desire made him blind. Another major factor was his misunderstanding of how Britain interpreted German motives. Hitler believed his message was clear. Germany wants the continent, Britain can keep the seas. You stay out of Europe, and I stay out of your empire. On paper, this seemed logical to him, but to British ears, this wasn't a deal. It was a warning. If Germany controlled the continent uncontested, what stopped it from eventually challenging the empire? Hitler thought Britain should be relieved that Germany had defeated France. In reality, Britain saw a threat rising that could eventually dominate the world. But Hitler never grasped this. He thought the British were being emotional, stubborn, prideful. In reality, Britain was being strategic in a way he never predicted. Hitler's worldview also made him treat Britain differently from other nations. He didn't issue the same harsh threats he used elsewhere. He didn't talk about dismantling Britain's empire or replacing its government. He didn't even plan for a long occupation. In his mind, conquering Britain wasn't necessary. Britain just had to accept reality. So even when the air campaign began, even when pressure intensified, he still expected Britain to make the first move toward negotiation. By the time he realized Britain wouldn't bend, months had already been wasted. One of the biggest misunderstandings came from the way Hitler interpreted British silence. Throughout the summer of 1940, Britain didn't signal anything. No interest in peace, no diplomatic feelers, no willingness to talk. And instead of interpreting this as defiance, Hitler interpreted it as fear. He thought Britain was stalling, waiting for emotions to calm before they accepted a deal. Churchill was actually stalling too, but for a completely different reason. Britain was desperately buying time. Time to train pilots, time to build planes, time to strengthen radar, time to bring the nation together psychologically, time to convince the world, especially the United States, that Britain was still in the fight. Hitler thought Britain was waiting for a negotiation window. Britain was waiting for a survival window. Another psychological factor was that Hitler believed the British ruling class secretly agreed with him. He saw them as old-school aristocrats who would rather negotiate with a strong leader than see Europe collapse into chaos. But this was based on his misreading of a small handful of elites who had admired Germany before the war. He mistook fringe elements for mainstream opinion. By 1940, the British government was united behind Churchill. The peace camp was politically dead, but Hitler didn't understand parliamentary politics. He didn't understand cabinet government. He didn't understand that democracies can become unified under pressure. He kept expecting a political shift that was never going to happen. What makes all of this even more striking is that Hitler kept giving Britain opportunities to negotiate, even after Dunkirk, even after France, even after beginning the air campaign. He repeatedly signaled through intermediaries that he was open to talks, but Britain never responded. The silence frustrated him. Part of him was impressed by it, but most of him saw it as irrational. In his mind, Britain staying in the war was a mistake that made no sense, and when a rival behaves in a way you cannot understand, it usually means you have misunderstood them completely. The final piece of the puzzle is perhaps the most revealing. Hitler believed Britain would make peace because he believed history would bend toward his vision. He was convinced that Germany's rise was unstoppable. He thought the collapse of France was proof that destiny was on his side. He thought Britain had only two options: adapt to the new era or be left behind. But history doesn't move because a dictator believes he is chosen. And Britain wasn't interested in adapting to a Europe ruled through intimidation. Churchill understood something that Hitler never did, that sometimes a nation chooses struggle, not because it expects victory, but because surrender would destroy its identity. While Hitler waited for peace, Britain rebuilt its air force. While he predicted negotiation, British factories ramped up production. While he imagined a handshake, Britain was preparing for a long conflict. And while he looked west expecting compromise, Churchill looked across the Atlantic expecting help. Britain's strategy was long-term. Hitler's strategy depended on everything happening quickly. The longer Britain refused to negotiate, the more his timeline fell apart. What Hitler never understood, not in 1940, not ever, was that Britain didn't stay in the war because it thought it could defeat Germany alone. It stayed in the war because it believed that resisting was the only morally acceptable choice. It wasn't strategy, it wasn't calculation, it was identity. An identity Hitler misread completely. In the end, Hitler expected peace because he thought Britain saw the world the way he did, through power, hierarchy, and raw logic. But Britain wasn't playing his game, and that misunderstanding became the opening that kept the entire conflict alive long enough for the world to change.